today, but we'll try and catch up as we get a little closer to break. Arnaud, welcome on stage.
Yeah. So now we'll talk a little bit more about governments and how they play such an active role in startup ecosystems. So every startup ecosystem have bottlenecks and all of them struggle at different things, but we can see a lot of bottlenecks that are similar across many ecosystem. So one of them is talent, right? So that have been covered a little bit today. But for example, this is one way to solve it from the Malaysian government. They're offering visa for entrepreneurs. We're going to talk a little bit later about that one, but they're quite generous compared to other governments. Lack of capital, that is often a big challenge. And you can see, for example, sometimes government also be involved doing fund of funds to nurture more VC fund at the early days. We can see a lot of liquidity issues, so that have been covered already a little bit today, and we're going to cover that also as well. So public market is one way, but we're also going to talk about secondaries. Education could be also quite a big of challenge, especially when you're in a very early stage ecosystem. So that was another program by Malaysian government with Stanford. So we're going to also talk a little bit about Stanford today and some other schools. Size of market could be a big challenge. So if you're US or Japan, it's not so much a big problem. But if you come from Southeast Asia or from Israel, you have a big challenge there. Beachhead is a program done by the New Zealand government about how do you give a board of advisors for half a day from experts from that local market to help those entrepreneurs to understand the market before they enter that place. Branding is also something quite important, and there's some ecosystems that are having very good branding and some other not very good. We're going to talk a little bit more about what France did in that sense with something called French Tech to promote that ecosystem across the world. And another point is a lack of density. So is what I think Mark also discussed of density in Los Angeles on space or on biotech. So that is something very interesting too. And some government are also working in that space. So we're going to describe a bit more what Singaporean government is doing with Block 71 and across several other buildings. So a big question, and what Mark covers a lot on the VC is the timing, is the why now, which is also a question asked very often by that tiny investors that you may heard of that have been playing that game for the last 50 years. Government play in a very different time horizon. They should come when it's too early for the VCs. They should come before. They should take that risk because they also play the game on a longer time frame, not just for them to be reelected, which some of them could be 3, 4, 5, or 7 years, but they're here for a longer period of time, where VCs usually is 10 years, so the timing is way more important for them. So we're going to look a little bit more at some governments and some of the history and what they have done. So if we go back to history of US, some people may start that with PayPal Mafia, and I know some people here are being involved with PayPal in different ways, but we can dig even if deeper. So some of you will know about the Fairchild Mafia and those 8 people who have very massive impact. Huh? Yeah, they're traders at that point. It's true. But we can even if that is mostly like the West Coast, right? But then you have also this man. I don't know if anyone recognize him. We're digging into a little bit less well-known people here. So that is East Coast. He was one of the most admired professor in Harvard University. He also ended up to be considered as the godfather of the VC industry. And he did one of his first investment in 57 with American Research and Development Corporation, and he got a massive home run with that deal. He also ended up to be the co-founder of INSEAD, the business school. So interestingly, as we see now, we already start to have a lot of involvement with different schools. And another one that have a very active role in the US have been Stanford, and I think Alan is not going to go against that point, right? Is carrying on the cap today. But also the army. And so that is something you can see across different ecosystem. For example, Israel, of course, but the US, the army play a lot of support to the ecosystem through the Cold War, through the World War II. George Doyo was also involved with the army. So you get a lot of that aspect too there. Another man that being very involved and also be considered as a godfather of Silicon Valley is Frederick Terman. So as we see so far, a lot of men. Unfortunately, we don't have that much women involved at that stage. Well, I'm going to share a few more later on. But you get a lot of university, a lot of governments, and things also take a very long time. Because here we're talking about things that started like 70 or 80 years ago. So it's very unfair to compare a lot of startup ecosystem to the US because you are comparing like a child to a teenager in the best case, or if not a young adult. So it's a massive gap anyway, and there's a lot of things you cannot compress. You cannot build a unicorn company in like 5 years. That is really an exception. It's take more like an overnight success in 10 years, as we hear often. So Israel is a very interesting ecosystem because compared to US, they have way less asset to start with in terms of size, in terms of languages. But if we look at the 7 challenge we mentioned before, they find different way to look after it and a way to that help the startup ecosystem there. So for talents, they have an ability to get any Jewish people to move to Israel if they wish. So that is kind of a large pool of talents. The downside of that is that makes real estate very expensive in Israel, and that is a big challenge for a lot of people there. For capital, they initially have a lot of lack of capital, but they have an initiative called Yozma where they're doing matchmaking. So they end up to the government to support a lot of VCs. And then now you get a lot of US VCs also being based in Israel. So access to capital is not so much an issue these days, but when you look at the size of the country and the size of the market, it looks like an impossible thing to solve at the beginning. So when you look at Japan, is way more capital here than what you get there at the beginning. Liquidity is a big issue there, especially when you're in a small market. So the advantage of Israel is 2 things. One is a lot of R&D center for all those large corporations. So it's like several hundred of them, which really help when you do an acquisition to integrate those company with your HQ through the R&D center. So there's a lot of M&A. That is a bit of drawback in that ecosystem. There's no much local giant being built. Is everything being sold and value being captured mostly by US companies. So if you look at Waze, for example, or all the technologies, at the end of the day, the US will own it. And I'll look at things like YouTube and Google. There's way more value created after acquisition than before. So that is a challenge also for Israel. They don't capture as much as value, but they still create a lot. Education is also a big thing, and that is very interesting. You will hear a lot about the army. You will hear a lot about the unit 8,200. Interestingly, one of the big challenges of Israel is the size of the population. It's such a tiny country that when they have to allocate every talent, and I literally say every because their men and women go to the army, they have to match make them to the right team. And then they're going for the men to work together for 3 years, the women 2 years. So they have like very tight team and they spend a lot of time together, but government cannot fuck up that matchmaking because they have so little amount of talent available. So that create like very deep connection. And when you ask around, if you know people who are helicopter pilot, they know the other guys. They know each other. It's like very, very tiny community there. For the lack of market, you will see Israel almost from day one is US market or built globally. So that is very interesting that they do that because in a way they don't have to ask themselves the question. I see that happen in a lot of mid-sized market. For example, France, people think it's big enough, but that is very dangerous because it's not big enough. It's too small. So you need quickly to be European or look at US to or global. And the one who do that quite well is Indian companies. They do quite often go global or US for the SaaS companies. So that is something people need to be careful about size of markets, but Israel find their way there. Branding, I think until you get Startup Nation, people didn't know much, but then now I think there's no much to talk about it. Density is almost everything happen in Tel Aviv. There's no much other options. So that is not much an issue there. So interestingly, that has also helped a lot the Israel startup ecosystem to get visibility. Was a Startup Nation. Interestingly, it became also Startup Nation Central, which is more like an association that provide a lot of support for the ecosystem. So they provide, for example, a lot of resources for free, including a massive database of VCs and startups. So that brings a lot of clarity to navigate the ecosystem. We're going to discuss that a little bit later, but that is one big challenge is a lot of those startup ecosystem are very opaque. They move very fast. So you need ways to explain to people how that work and how to discover it. So 42 gigs is great, but it's only 42 people at a time. So even if you do 4 trips a year, we need also other scalable way to do it. And then you get that organization that have been studied again 60 years ago is Israel Innovation Authority, which is an independent organization that do a lot of policies and support for the ecosystem. So that is very interesting. It's not the government directly. They have kind of an NGO between to do those kind of thing and support it. So they have been doing a lot of great thing, and is why Singapore, for example, inspired themselves a lot through Israel, and a lot of other governments look after Israel as a way to learn about it. So France, as you guessed by now, I'm originally from France. I don't know if you recognize any of those companies here. So at least one, which I'm pretty sure you didn't know was French, is the second one, VLC. So that is a French company. So before streaming, you may have used it a lot for your video. But the Minitel was kind of the beginning of the internet in France. If you check your credit cards on the back, you will only see two companies. One is called Gemalto. And if you don't have Gemalto, quite often you will get Oberture. Those two companies are French, but terrible at marketing. So you get great engineers in France. You will see a lot of them these days in AI and Gen AI. Jan Luken, that you may have heard of at Facebook, is French. But marketing, French are very bad. We need the American to do that for us. Ubisoft is a gaming. Here is Assassin's Creed. So we do a lot also in a gaming space. But branding, very bad. Very, very bad. And then we had that initiative called French Tech, and where they decided to brand in a better way the ecosystem across the world, and they wanted to get that known. So they get this small roster, and they get it as a red one. The blue one is more for hardware, and they have a few other ways to look at it. But the idea was also quite interesting, is branding and community. So if you come in almost all the main startup ecosystem, you can get a WhatsApp group or Slack group where the language will be English and not French, and where they will gather most of the French community and some other people who want to join. So it's open to everyone. And that is something that the French government have been supporting through grants and other initiatives. This is something very interesting that France is doing now for a few years, where they showcase the top 40 and top 120 startup of the local ecosystem, which give a lot of visibility to them. Of course, such things we can always discuss the methodology and which have been selected and which one haven't been selected, but at least it bring more visibility to the ecosystem, and it make it easier for people to navigate it. The French government, through their sovereign wealth fund, BPI France, they also bring sometimes some US top VC to come to France and explore the ecosystem. So they do such initiative to make those connections. So now, thanks to that, here you can have like 4 companies that are being showcased. I guess at least you recognize one soccer player, maybe not the company behind it. But here is like some companies that are French, and Sora is more about the new Panini, if you know. And here I just picked those 4 kind of randomly, but interestingly, all of them have the same investor. It's Xavier Niel. We're going to talk a little bit more about him. So he's either invest directly personally through his kind of PE fund, NGG, or he also do through Kima Ventures. But then you see the sovereign wealth funds, BPI France. So in France, it's kind of a joke, is you always get money directly or indirectly from them, because they will do venture debt, they will do direct investment, they're going to be LPs in funds. They offer like so much different financing way that almost every startup in one way or other will get money from them. So that is always happening there. I'm sorry for the red, it was sharp, but we got an issue with the slide. But here you get also, even if some Korean or Japanese company investing in those French companies, you get, of course, the French one. So here is like 2 funds. The KM is Kylian Mbappe, who invested personally into Sorar. And then you get, of course, some American organization investing there. But the branding also help a lot to get more visibility and get more access for those companies. So as I mentioned, the French tech is having hub across the world. So you have like 64 communities across the world. And one of them is, of course, Tokyo, which I recall correctly is operated as a Slack here, not a WhatsApp, but quite often is WhatsApp or sometimes even Facebook group. So that is also a way to connect for people across the world. I mentioned I will talk about Xavier Niel. Does anyone know 42? Okay, maybe we don't have enough developers here. We only have the we only have the investors. So 42 is a coding school that done very differently, where you don't have professors, it's peer learning, and you learn through the machine. So that is a school that he created and then now expanded in 30 or 40 different locations. And after that, he also have created something called Station F that people may go in France may know about it. Is the arts of the early stage startup ecosystem in Paris, so therefore in France. And he also provide accommodation with something called Flatmates and Kima Ventures, which is his fund. So with Kima, he does around 100 investment per year. Interestingly, only first check, no follow-on. And they roughly, for all of them, do 100K euro. So that's Xavier Niel, is a French billionaire. And as we can see, sometimes you have some individuals that can have as big impact as some governments. So when you look at Station F, it's very interesting because it's a massive building. That is a 250 million budget to launch that, but they split it across different ways. So you have the share zone, the create zone, and the chill zone. So you can see like the create zone is like more quiet, more restricted area, and is where startup are big builds. The share zone is more like an event space, and the chill zone is more like the restaurant. So they have like different level of interaction across the space and different level of access. But that is very interesting to look at how people can exchange and join that space. They host, in fact, a lot of corporates and government program there. They don't want to be described as a co-working space, but you can see a lot of top brands like from Facebook to Naver to LVMH having their own accelerator for startups. And interestingly, we also get some other people who are doing quite a bit across the ecosystem. So here also, interestingly, we go back to a billionaire about doing a lot across the ecosystem at different stages. So again, for Station F, there were rumors, there were maybe some tax break from the government. That could be also sometime interesting to see how government can partner with those individuals that are already very active across the whole startup ecosystem. So let's look at Singapore. I mean, some of you may know about Temasek, very well known for their amazing investment in FTX, if I recall correctly. They have to fire a few people and punish a few people for that. But I mean, in a way, if that never happened, maybe they don't take enough risk. But when you have the money as a sovereign wealth fund, it's a bit more challenging. So those are like mostly Singaporean-based company when they have majority investment. For some of them is 100% investment. So they're very focused on those businesses. But they also have minority investment in companies that are based across Southeast Asia, but also Europe or China. Interestingly about Temasek is they have a lot of other subsidiaries. Here, I didn't list all of them, but you have a few. 65 equity partner is very interesting because their goal is to invest in a company at a later stage, like Series C, D, and then help them to go for the IPO. If you look at Innoven or Evolution Debt Capital, that is venture debt. One, they partner with UOB. The other one, they partner with DBS. But remember, DBS is a company they have also quite a bit of shareholding. So as that they're working with themselves. Here you get some other interesting one. I will just mention two. Menalia is a very interesting one because that is a venture building. So I was like, wait a minute, like a sovereign wealth fund with hundreds of billion under management is building company from scratch. How long that is going to take to have an impact for them? But they're trying that. So that is kind of something quite new there. And Vertex, we're going to cover a little bit more about it. But interestingly, they have been also investing in a bunch of venture funds that are mostly focused. I mean, those ones are focused Southeast Asia. My guess is small check. And what they bring to them is mostly branding. If you're a fund and you can say that the sovereign wealth fund is your LP, that definitely helped to open a lot of doors. So BPI do that as a next level stage. I think it's 500-600 funds that are LPs. Temasek is very selected, very small group of funds that are supporting across the ecosystem. But as you can see here, a few, they didn't have done fund one. They have done fund two, fund three, fund four. Because for two reasons, most of those fund one were 10 million or sub 10 million. It was the early days of the Singaporean startup ecosystem. Second, they were already supported by another program by NRF when it was a matching program close to the Yozam program in Israel they get inspired for. So that program as a government is interesting because they get close to a dozen of VC funds. Today is only 3 of them have survived. So is most of them a failure, but it's kind of, as Mark mentioned, you do 40 deals, you get 6 bringing the return. They've done a dozen, they get 3 kind of bringing the return for them. So government also need to be comfortable with taking risk and absorbing that failure, which could be sometimes quite difficult for government entities. So I'll go a little bit deeper into Vertex. They started in 1988 and it was part of ST Engineering. So it was more a CVC. But if you remember, ST is owned by Temasek. So then they changed kind of who is the owner and they moved it to Temasek in 2008. But here, what I don't mention, they also have a program called Technopreneurship Fund. So if you go in Singapore, don't mention that to any government official. They have very bad memories about that fund. It was $1 billion fund. And the focus was to bring mostly US investors to set up shop in Singapore. I think they barely managed to deploy half of it, and none of the US investors moved to Singapore. It still bring back money, so it wasn't bad in terms of financial, but the main objective was to bring those people to Singapore, and that didn't happen. So it's kind of a difficult stories for them there. And then from being a fund, Vertex become these massive beasts. So that is public information. I'm not disclosing anything private here. But they had like a lot, they decided to have a lot of funds across geographies. They also have fund of funds, as well as vertical fund like healthcare or growth stage funds. So that is, they build like that big fund, and they also started to be more and more independent outside of Temasek. So they started to have external LPs to back Vertex. So it's still considered as a very linked to Temasek, but it's getting less and less dependent of Temasek. I mentioned about space, and it's very important for people to meet. So here, if you can see the blue building, it was the first building of that initiative. It was supposed to be completely teared down, but they decided to save it, which was from GTC, which is a real estate arm of the government, and Singtel, which is a company that is also where Temasek have a lot of money there. And then they decided now to have around 6 or 7 buildings. So it's a mix of building they save from destruction. So it's like industrial building, and some building that they build brand new. Like you can see the yellow one on the front part of the picture is a brand new one. So they build that density of startups. So it's end up to be a little bit like Station F in France. If you want to see early stage startup, you are going to end up to spend time here. So they have also some food option there. They have also those kind of directories for you when you are there to see which startup are there. They also have some sports facilities as well as event facilities there. So they build that kind of hub. And interestingly, what you can see here is INSEAD is just in front of it, the school created by George Dorio, and NUS, which is the top school in Singapore, and I think maybe not top 15 in Asia. They're also just behind, but it's a massive campus, like an American campus. So it's not that easy to connect between the two, but they're very close. And NUS will also have its own facilities inside those buildings and their own community. In fact, they launched something called Block 71 across the world. So you have one in San Francisco, you have one in Indonesia, you have in China. So you can find also that network of Singaporean across the world. And often they will end up to cluster around that space in those cities. Another billionaire, interestingly, it seems is that what I found is mostly 40 years old male billionaire. I'm looking at the woman. So if you have any suggestion, I'm very open. But here, what is interesting is you may have heard about this downtown project that Tony was working on, and he looked a lot about collision, also about how people meet. And interestingly, he's also having a portfolio of projects. So some of them are DTP, which is downtown project. It was Life is Beautiful, which is more about running events. VTF Capital, which is an investment vehicle, or Nine Bridge School, which is about doing education. So interestingly, when you look at those few billionaires, they look at a lot of different verticals. Some of them also go into the media and all the things, but when you look, there's quite a deep connection around like the entrepreneurship there. So a few interesting initiatives to look after. So I mentioned in the beginning the visa. I think Shock is going to agree with me. That is the best flag ever we can see, right? So that is Malaysia flag. So interestingly, Malaysia offer a very generous visa. They offer 5 years visa for entrepreneur for the experimented one. If you are fresh new is 1 year, but when you renew, you get 5. So interestingly, they commit to you where some other government commit less. So France offer you 4 years. Interestingly, those two countries will also offer roughly the same length for the investor visa. And then you will get UK will offer you like 3 years, and then Singapore. So Singapore is very transactional. They offer you 1 year. And then when you renew, 1 year. And then you renew, 2 years. Where interestingly, if you are working as an employee, as a foreigner in Singapore, usually your first visa is 2 years, and then you can go into a 3-year visa. So Singapore is, okay, you can be an entrepreneur, but please show me result in 1 year, because everyone know in 1 year you can do so much as an entrepreneur. I'm joking a little bit. They don't ask you much to renew it, but still they only give you 1 year. And what people may don't know, if you're not working as a foreigner, in Singapore, the last 6 months, you cannot open a new bank account. You cannot sign a new lease. So it's kind of, you just have 6 months of freedom as a visa. And then you have 6 months is kind of probation until you get your next one of 1 year, right? So that is something I think a lot of governments should think about, is those people that move to your country to build a business, they're not showing the easiest path is very challenging compared to being an employee. But at the same time, they already have a massive challenge in terms of cash runway. Please don't add a visa runway for them to know how many more months they can stay in the country. I think that is way too much trouble. Government should offer a little bit longer, especially places that are quite expensive to live. If you're in Singapore, trust me, even if they give you 5 years, it can be very costly to live there. So if your business is not going well, you may move elsewhere. It will be very challenging to stay there for a very long time. Something that I think quite interestingly on public market, which is also a way to offer quite a liquidity. So here you get the Singapore public market or the Indonesian public market. You get those two gentlemen who get appointed quite recently. So Kubunwi is a self-made man, who has been on the board of almost every Singapore-owned company from Singtel to DBS to Singapore Airlines. But just recently, he got appointed as a chairman of the stock exchange. What people may don't know, you may expect Singapore to be the leading stock exchange in Southeast Asia. In fact, they're behind Thailand, interestingly. So that is quite challenging for them there. And then Indonesia is the one also pushing very hard. Is still an option for a lot of Indonesian companies to be listed there. But what is interesting is those two gentlemen, they also are founding GPs of VC funds. And they end up to be on the board of a public listed of the public listing thing. And Kubunwi is also having his family office, which is called Black Kite. And through that, he do angel investment. He's also LPs in funds. So it's very interesting to see his profile to be as a chairman of the stock exchange and going to know very well about private market. And Pendu is doing NDS Capital 2, which is a secondary fund. So he also knows a lot about secondaries, and he comes also from a pretty good family in Indonesia. So it's quite interesting to see all those connections. And interestingly, those two men roughly same time happen to be on the board of the stock exchange. So I'm wondering to see if we're going to see that more often in more of the place to connect a little bit more private and public markets. Conferences are always being something to connect people. And some good startup being built from there. I think Uber was built because Paris sucks as getting taxis. So those guys have to build something. So some ecosystem have started way before. So you look at Dubai with GTEx have been there for a very long time. Then you start to get Saudi was like, hey, we should have our own events. So they pay some people from Informa to do Leap, which also the people who do super return for people attending such event. And then just now you get Doha, who decided also to pay Web Summit to get their own event there. Interestingly, that could be quite costly. So that is a public figure, and that is how much Lisbon, the city, is paying for a 10 years contract to bring a lot of people into their ecosystem and also to really support the touristic part of it. Interestingly, they do it in November. So when there's not much people in Portugal, so you can really absorb, but you can also really offer like a 1 week of a lot of business for all those organizations there. Lastly, back to Malaysia, corporate could be also part of it. So here is like a tax incentive system offered by the Malaysian government to support corporate to set up their VC arm. So that is also a way to externalize that. It's not only about the VC, but corporate can also play a role. And often corporate are not very loved in the startup ecosystem, but I think people should remember that most of M&A come from corporates. Corporate are LPs in many funds. I think on Dave's slide, a lot of LPs in Japan were corporates. And they're also the clients of most of your B2B startups. So corporate really play an important role in any startup ecosystem. So to finish, a few things we would like to see more. So fund of fund to focus on emerging fund manager, especially people raising fund 1, fund 2. There's very few people willing to make those bets. So government should support that. Also difficult to find the fund of fund to do only that. So it's also a question of how do you incentivize people to go there? After that, debt fund also very important later on the ecosystem. So that is something also usually is quite difficult to raise when you're among the first few. And secondary fund will come after because you need to provide liquidity to the first two. So that is also something very important. And we don't see much support from government for such initiatives. Interestingly, Canada was working on a fund. If you want to have fund of fund, you need to go a little bit behind. So that is also a very interesting initiative because at one point, government should only come here to solve the bottleneck and then withdraw themselves and go to the next bottleneck. Of course, that is just an image. You have several bottlenecks to solve at the same time. So that is the role of the government to do all of them. And please give 5 years visa to entrepreneur. Don't give them just a 1 year to get their things done in a new country. So that it for me. You can scan the QR code to connect on LinkedIn or send me an email if you have any question. Thank you.
Check. Can we just go back to the last slide that Arnaud was showing? I just wanted to highlight a few things here. So for everybody, we tend to use this shorthand of FOF. That stands for Fund of Funds. We're going to be talking a lot about that today. That's a VC, a fund that invests in other funds. And I haven't seen the fund of fund before too much, but that's an interesting abstraction. I think this point I want to just keep making, and I'm sure the Japanese government has also got several topics we're going to discuss later today on this. We'll have a session specifically at 3 p.m. on fund of funds in the US that invest in emerging managers. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. And for the Japanese folks in the audience, please don't use your fund of funds to invest in established VC funds. They don't need the money. You need to invest in emerging managers who are on their fund ones and twos, even if they might fail. Yes, I'm going to raise my voice. I know you're telling me to lower my voice. The translators in the back are like blowing their ears out, but I'm trying to make sure that we make this point. Some of you may have seen a talk that I did 10 years ago in Osaka where I was banging the gavel with my shoe, I think, Khrushchev style.
Well, on that one, maybe a good example we can mention in the US will be Sendana. So Michael Kim and his team.
We have a bunch, and we'll talk about that later today. But Sendana also, even Sendana actually invests in probably fund threes, not as much fund ones and twos.
I've done some fund one, fund two in South Asia and India.
They have a nano fund, absolutely. But I want to emphasize all the things that Arnaud had mentioned here are critical for the ecosystem, and even venture debt and secondary fund structures are very important. But the one I really want to make sure is, in order to get your ecosystem started, you need lots of startups. Big VC firms generally are not investing in early stage startups. They're investing in later stage companies that are already successful. And they will complain and moan about, oh, there's not enough talent to invest in, not enough great companies. And yeah. How do you get those great companies? You invest in lots of little shitty companies, 3% of which go public 10 years later. Who invests in those shitty little companies? Emerging managers and seed funds. Who invests in those seed funds? Fund of funds. So I will emphasize that point, and I'll use this cane to this is great. I really don't need this thing. I just use the cane for sympathy and to make you think that I'm important. But we'll keep coming back to this topic. I know we're running a little bit over.
I mean, that is also simplification. Like a lot of those first-time fund manager will raise a lot from corporate, will raise a lot from people like Russells. So you also need to have the right tax incentive aligned for those people and allow them to invest. So they are never going to raise all the money from fund of fund, but the advantage of the fund of fund is usually they will commit for 2 or 3 funds. So that is better quality money for GP. So it's why here we focus on that one. But there's a lot of other type of investors joining those funds.
And something that Arnaud mentioned that I also want to emphasize is venture capital in the US and in many other countries was initially subsidized by government, heavily subsidized by government, starting in the 60s in the US. Through the SBA program and the SSBIC programs. Even Bill Draper and Tim Draper started their very first fund using matching funds coming from the US government and the SSBIC funds. And Arnaud's point before about this did not happen overnight. The US venture capital ecosystem has been in development for 70 or 80 years. The first 30 or 40 years of that was heavily subsidized by the US military and the US government. It did not happen magically private capital out of nowhere. It happened because the government made a huge investment in venture capital and innovation and research, initially through the military and then later through academic institutions.
And I think another gentleman, I think I was enough men on my slides, but another one that play a big impact in the US will be David Svensson from Yale. So he ended up to invest a lot on venture capital. I think it was close to 20% of the endowment fund, but also endowment fund, especially from school, have a lot of tax break. So that is another thing that also support a lot the ecosystem in the US. And you don't have much endowment fund in other countries. It depends also of the retirement system.
And also in the US in the 1970s, something that was called the prudent man rule changed, which allowed US mutual funds to invest in venture capital funds. That was actually an explosion of venture capital that funded Kleiner, Perkins, and Sequoia, and several of those others. Even though they might have started around that time, they raised a ton of capital that came because of that change in the law that allowed mutual funds in the U.S. Okay, we've been nerding out a lot on this. We have one more speaker before our break. My partner, Aman Verji, who wears a big cowboy hat, although he doesn't live in Texas. And he's going to give us a little picture on global